Introduction: The Forgotten Chains of Mongolian Slavery. The Mongol Empire, founded by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, is often remembered for its vast conquests, military innovations, and strategic brilliance. At its height, it stretched from China to Eastern Europe, shaping the course of history with its unparalleled dominance. However, beneath the glory of the Mongol war machine and the grandeur of its Khans, a darker reality existed, one of subjugation, servitude, and suffering. Mongolian society was structured around a rigid hierarchy, where power and privilege were concentrated in the hands of the ruling elite, warriors, and nobility. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the slaves, captives taken during war, criminals sentenced to lifelong servitude, or debt-ridden individuals who had no choice but to forfeit their freedom. These slaves endured grueling labor, physical abuse, and the complete loss of autonomy. While Mongol leaders valued loyalty and strength, they had little regard for the well-being of those they enslaved. Under the rule of Genghis Khan and his successors, slavery was an integral part of the empire's economic and military system. Enslaved men and women were forced into back-breaking labor, tending to livestock, building cities, and even serving as human shields on the battlefield. Their lives were marked by suffering, with escape being nearly impossible, and resistance often met with brutal punishment. Unlike in some societies where slaves could rise to prominence through merit, Mongolian slaves rarely had such opportunities. This piece will delve into the harsh and insane realities of Mongolian slavery, exploring the daily struggles of the enslaved, the brutal punishments they faced, their role in warfare, and the psychological torment of a life without freedom. By uncovering this often overlooked aspect of history, we aim to shed light on the cost of Mongol expansion and the forgotten voices that suffered beneath the weight of an empire. The origins of slavery in Mongolia. Slavery in Mongolia existed long before the rise of Genghis Khan, but it became more widespread and institutionalized under the Mongol Empire. The Mongols, originally nomadic herders, lived in tribal societies where power was determined by strength, loyalty, and warfare. Before Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes, slavery was already a part of Mongolian culture, primarily in the form of war captives, criminals, and individuals who fell into debt. However, with the rapid expansion of the Mongol Empire, slavery became a large-scale system that fueled both the economy and military. Most Mongolian slaves were war captives taken from defeated tribes and conquered civilizations. Genghis Khan and his successors waged ruthless wars across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, enslaving millions in the process. After a successful military campaign, Mongol forces would sort the captured population into different categories. Skilled artisans, engineers, and scholars were often spared and given positions in Mongolian society. Warriors, nobles, and anyone deemed a threat were executed. The remaining men, women, and children were taken as slaves. Aside from war captives, criminals, and those unable to pay debts could also become slaves. In Mongolian tribal law, severe crimes, such as betrayal or theft, could result in enslavement as punishment. Additionally, those who failed to repay debts often found themselves forced into servitude, sometimes for life. Unlike some civilizations where debt slaves could eventually earn their freedom, Mongolian debt slavery was often permanent unless a master chose to release them. Types of Mongolian slaves. Mongolian slaves could generally be divided into three main categories. 1. Household slaves. These individuals served Mongol nobility and wealthy families. Their duties included cooking, cleaning, tending to livestock, and performing other domestic chores. While some were treated relatively well, they had no personal rights and could be beaten or executed at the master's discretion. 2. Labor slaves. These slaves were used for physically demanding tasks, such as building fortifications, digging wells, and maintaining roads and bridges. They endured some of the harshest conditions, often working to exhaustion and receiving minimal food and shelter. 3. Military slaves. The Mongols were infamous for their brutal military tactics, and slaves played a role in their conquests. Some were used as human shields during battles, forced to walk in front of Mongol armies to absorb enemy arrows. Others were assigned to construct siege weapons or scout enemy positions under the constant threat of execution. A life without hope. Regardless of how they entered slavery, Mongolian slaves lived under extreme oppression. They were considered property rather than people, with no rights or legal protections. Any attempt to escape was punishable by death, and rebellious slaves were often executed in the most gruesome ways imaginable to serve as a warning to others. Unlike some ancient societies where slaves could gain status or buy their freedom, Mongolian slavery offered almost no path to escape. The origins of Mongolian slavery reveal a cruel and unforgiving world where the weak were at the mercy of the strong. For the slaves trapped in this system, life was a daily battle for survival, filled with suffering, fear, and the crushing realization that they would never taste freedom again. The daily life of a Mongolian slave. For a Mongolian slave, life was a relentless cycle of exhaustion, suffering, and humiliation. Unlike free Mongols who lived as nomads, warriors, or herders, slaves were stripped of all autonomy and forced to serve their masters in whatever way was required. Whether they were household servants, laborers, or military slaves, their days were filled with grueling tasks, constant abuse, and the ever-present fear of punishment. Back-breaking labor from dawn to dusk. Slaves in Mongolia had no control over their time. They awoke before sunrise and began their work immediately, often without proper food or rest. Their daily tasks varied, depending on their role. Household slaves had to clean, cook, serve meals, and tend to the livestock of their Mongol masters. Some also worked as personal attendants, constantly at the beck and call of noble families. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable, as they were often forced into servitude as concubines. Labor slaves endured some of the harshest conditions, working on construction projects, digging wells, or tending to the vast herds of horses and cattle that sustained the Mongol economy. These slaves worked until they were physically incapable, with no regard for their well-being. Military slaves were often used as disposable tools in warfare. They were ordered to carry supplies, build siege weapons, and dig trenches. The most unfortunate were sent to the front lines of battle as human shields, forced to absorb enemy fire before Mongol warriors attacked. Regardless of their specific roles, Mongolian slaves shared one common experience: brutal treatment and absolute control by their masters. No rights, no escape. A Mongolian slave had no legal rights. They were considered property, not people, and could be traded, gifted, or killed at the whim of their owners. Masters had total authority, and a disobedient or weak slave could be executed without any consequences. Some were beaten for minor mistakes, while others were left to starve if they were no longer useful. Attempting to escape was nearly impossible. The Mongol Empire was vast, covering harsh deserts, mountains, and endless grasslands. A runaway slave had nowhere to hide. Even if they managed to flee, Mongols had one of the most efficient horseback communication systems in history, the Yam postal system, meaning that news of an escaped slave could spread rapidly across the empire. Anyone caught trying to run was tortured and killed as a warning to others. The psychological toll of slavery. Beyond the physical hardships, Mongolian slaves suffered from deep psychological torment. Knowing that they would never regain their freedom, they lived under the constant weight of hopelessness. Some resisted in small ways, working slower, breaking tools, or even poisoning their masters, but most were too afraid to rebel. For many, the only escape from their misery was death. Some slaves took their own lives, rather than endure another day of suffering. Others simply gave up, letting starvation and exhaustion take them. Life as a Mongolian slave was not just difficult, it was inhuman. Stripped of dignity, forced into relentless labor, and denied even the hope of escape, they lived in a world of unimaginable cruelty.